Welcome to the review of Chapter 5, Interpreting and Summarizing Publicized Research. As we talked about in the previous chapter, we have now come up with a research problem and a research question, or maybe also some research sub-questions. The next step for us is to begin to conduct a literature review, which basically means researching and identifying other pieces of research, typically research articles that address the same topic in which we are interested. That research typically begins online, and when you begin to identify articles that looks like that they fit your research topic, quickly do a scanning or a skimming of the article to see that it is actually relevant and that it will be meaningful for your research. Once you have identified that, begin with reading the abstract. The abstract typically summarizes the research problem, the methodology, and also the major findings of the study. So it is a good way to get an initial idea about what the research article is about. Next, look at the titles and the introduction to the research report. Scan the methodology, the findings, the conclusions, and the discussions. And then, as you begin to take notes, you summarize the report. And for this class, you will be identifying a minimum of 4 research articles that is relevant to your topic. That means that if you are in a group of 4, you will have about a total of 16 research articles to help you develop more clarity about your research project. If you're a group of 5, you will have about 20 research articles. So you really, as you're beginning to identify your research articles, should have good communication with one another so that you don't identify the same articles. Once you begin your summary, it is important to get the title of the article, the author or authors, as well as the references correct. Use this form here, which you can also find on the resource template on the resource page. It's called the article summary template to summarize your articles. As I note here in parentheses, using APA style is absolutely essential. It is a requirement for a research class that APA style is being applied consistently. The next thing you summarize is that you identify what the research design is. Is it a qualitative, a quantitative, a mixed method, or an action research report that you are writing? Next, what was the research problem and the research questions? At times you will find in articles that due to space, there is not necessarily the space to outline or bullet point the research question. So you might have to identify and stick with the research problem as the researchers or the authors have identified it. Next, you begin to look at the area that typically is titled methodology. First you begin to look at who were the participants of the study. How many were they? How were they selected? What demographic information may you have? Did the authors use pre-existing classrooms, a cohort of existing students that were grouped in a certain way? Or was there in any way any kind of sampling procedures taking place? In each of the 2 major research directions, quantitative and qualitative research, there are a number of sampling procedures that lends itself to each of these 2 research traditions. Also, it is important to look at if we have any information about the demographics of the sample that was used for the study. How many males, how many females? Were they all English speaking? What were the age group, socioeconomic status, or whatever else that the authors might have included as relevant in the research article? The next area is looking at what did the researchers actually do? Did they administer a survey? Did they conduct interviews? Did they use some different instructional strategies? Did they use a flipped classroom approach? Did they use project-based learning or student-centered learning? Did they test a new textbook? Did they, whatever it might be, but describe what the researchers did. Next, how did the researchers collect data on whatever it is that they did? Did they conduct surveys? Did they use standardized assessments, pre and post, or just post tests? Did they conduct interviews? What ways did they collect data that were meant to answer the research questions that they had stated as part of their research project? The next step is looking at the data analysis procedures. If we are dealing with a qualitative piece of research, they would be using what is called inductive data analysis. This is basically a structured, rigorous approach to analyzing words or observations in order for us to come to findings from the data that we collected. We also, in qualitative research, do use some descriptive statistics, for instance, describing who the participants or the informants, as we often call them in qualitative research, who were they, what information do we have about them. Otherwise, descriptive statistics are typically used in survey type of quantitative research. In other types of quantitative research, of course, we use inferential statistics, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. The next part of the summary of each of the research article is that what were the findings, what were the conclusions. Sometimes in this section there's also a discussions about recommendations for future research, which actually may help you become better informed about what it is that your research should focus on. And then last but not least, what is the relevance to your study? What holes were discovered in the research? Are you attempting to replicate what has already been done? Or how does this article that you selected for the literature review apply to the research that you will be involved with? As I mentioned before, there are different statistical pieces of information that can be used in research. Mertler talks about three broad categories. He talks about status statistics, which basically are descriptive statistics describing people, places, etc. Comparisons, where we are comparing two or more groups on some kind of a variable. And at times we are also doing statistics on covariant relationships, where there might be multiple relationships that have predictions for the problem that we are investigating. Status reports, or what I like to refer to as descriptive statistics, basically use raw data that we have collected about the participants in the study. One of the most common descriptive statistics that is being used is typicality, or what we oftentimes or most commonly refer to as central tendency. That we typically talk about the mean, the median, and the mode, and each of those have a different meaning. So they are measures of central tendency. Many of you will be taking comprehensive exams in the future, and a question that has often been asked in some of these exams is that describe and discuss measures of central tendency and give an example about how each could be used by you. Another descriptive statistic that is often used is spread of diversity. One is oftentimes talked about as the range. Let's say that we have a range of scores that range between 62 and 98. The range is the difference between those two. So 98 minus 62, the range of these scores are 36. Another way of looking at diversity is using standard deviations. You are all familiar, have seen the normal curve, which is a different way also of describing how data falls and the percentage of scores or information, the data that we have collected, how they fall on a normal distribution. Sometimes, of course, these distributions can be skewed. The last form of descriptive statistics is what is called conversion or transformational scores. Some of the common ones are the ones that you are familiar with, percentile scores. If you had to take some kind of a standardized test like the Miller's Analogy test or something like that to be admitted into grad school, these types of scores are oftentimes reported as percentiles. So if your score came back and you reported in the 63rd percentile, it means that your score was as good or better compared or as 63% of the people who took the same test. So that's percentile ranks. Oftentimes we also see scores getting converted into grade equivalents or age equivalents. So typical ways then of looking at these kind of conversion and transformational scores. When we are looking at comparative research, we are oftentimes using different types of statistics. Three primary ones: the chi-square, the t-test, on the ANOVA, which are described here, and I will give an example of each. The chi-square. Let's say that I have taught 9th grade science for several years and I have observed that many of my students appear to be disengaged in my science classes. I've just taken a class at University of Richmond where I learned about the flipped classroom and want to investigate if my students' engagement improve after using the flipped classroom strategy. So what I do is that I conduct an anonymous survey of my students before and after I use the flipped classroom. I ask them 3 questions anonymously. The questions could be, I'm engaged in science class, I'm engaged in science class at times, when the teacher look at me, or I'm not engaged in science class. The scores that I get, I tally them and I find out that 32 of my students said that they were engaged in science class. You can see that is called the expected score or the pretest score. 42 report that they are engaged at time, and 26 report that they are not engaged in science class. One would expect reasonably that if the flipped classroom had no impact whatsoever on student engagements, that I would get the same score after I had used the flipped classroom strategy. However, the scores that I get now are what I call the observed scores or the post scores. I see that 52% of my students now report that they're not engaged, 34 report that they are engaged at times, and 14 report that they are not engaged. So the chi-square is simply a statistical analysis that let us know whether we get those observed scores as a result of error or chance, or if there really is a statistical difference in these scores, which of course then would lead us to believe that it is because of me using the flipped classroom approach. A t-test example. Let's say that I have decided to use project-based learning approach in my social studies class to teach students about the US Constitution. I have another social worker at my school who absolutely believes that their traditional classes are just as effective as beginning to have to do all this preparation and create a project. So we agree that I will use a project-based learning approach and that the other teacher will be using a traditional, more lecture type of a format. At the end of the unit on the US Constitution, we give the students the same test. The average score in my class on the test is a 91, and in the other's classroom, it's an 89. Now, here is the question. Of course, I would like to argue that I got a higher score because I used project-based learning. And of course, the other teacher would like to argue, there's really no difference here. My teaching strategy was just as good. But how do we know if it was really a result of chance or sampling error, or if there really is a statistical difference? And that's what the t-test will help us determine. Last but not least, we oftentimes used what is called an analysis of variance, or an ANOVA. It is used to determine whether differences exist between 3 or more groups based on variability of scores about the means. So let's say now that teachers from other schools hear about me using the project-based learning approach. And they have some ideas about other ways. Maybe somebody wants to use the flipped classroom approach, and somebody wants to use an online approach. Now we have a variety of different teaching strategies. We also have different class sizes, so the t-test is no longer good for us in order to determine whether the results that we get at the end of the course by using the same test is a result of chance, or if it is because that they are significantly different from one another, and that's what the ANOVA test will do for us. So we can also use correlational reports. Sometimes you see, a couple of the examples that I gave in my previous discussion of the previous chapter was, is there a relationship between the number of adverse childhood experiences and students' ability to self-regulate at school? So really what we are looking at is that we are looking at a relationship. That is the type of thing that the Pearson correlation coefficient will help us determine. Whenever we are talking about relationships, we are talking about variables that range between -1 and +1. So whenever we are in the plus ranges, we are talking about a positive relationship. When we are in the minuses, we are talking about that there is a negative relationship between the two variables that we are using. In research, we sometimes toss around the word significant and significance, and it's important to understand the difference between these two terms. When we talk about that something is significant, it is really a question about whether a topic or a research problem is worthy of investigation. When we talk about significance, we refer to statistical significance. And that is, as we say here, is that it is interpreted as that it is very likely that the findings we observed in the sample also exist in the population. We all determine this kind of likelihood or this probability as it relates to what we call our alpha levels, which typically range in education between 0.05 and 0.01, which basically, if we were to summarize something that is significant at the 0.01 level, it means that we can be 99% sure that the results we got was because of the intervention, the new teaching strategy that we used, and not a result of error or coincidence. If something is significant at the 95% level, it means that we can be 95% certain that the results we got were a result of the interventions that we used. So here are a couple of places where you can go and seek other information about websites that are related to writing a literature review. Thank you so much.